Okay, so what is a living shoreline? That is a very good question. So there are a bunch of different terms and words that have come about from living shorelines. There's the use of green stabilization, soft infrastructure, nature-based, vegetative stabilization, ecologically enhanced areas. There's so many different words and terms that have been thrown out through the years, but living shorelines is kind of what it has turned into. A living shoreline in itself is not a new concept. It's been around since the 1970s, but it has only become popular again, or a preferable method as like the early 2000s is when it started to become more practiced widely. So, and that is because of a number of things. One is the current trends in shoreline protection methods. So using an example in Delaware, so there is armoring going on and has been and continues to be armoring of our shorelines. But what does that mean exactly? Well, in our Rehoboth Bay, we have 15.5% hardened shoreline, 19% in Indian River. And if you look at this graph here, you can see that the yellow areas are all the areas where shoreline hardening is happening. And it's happening more and more. But there are some initiatives to try and prevent that. But if we look at armored shorelines across the U.S., 14% of the continental U.S. has armored shorelines that are hardened. And then if you focus down into some of the coastal cities, there's greater than 50% hardening going on. And that is having impacts on how our shorelines are working and how they're functioning. But what does that mean for protecting infrastructure and trying to keep the land from moving? And what are the issues with armoring? Well, you have the problem of losing that land-water connection, where you're, hold on a second, the land and water don't have direct access to each other. There's habitat loss and fragmentation. The way the two are connected, they're no longer connected anymore. They're disjointed. And then that movement of sediment from one area to the other causes major issues. And if you're looking at this picture, a lot of times those bulkheads don't prevent erosion. They cause issues in themselves, which is never good. And then when you go and put in this bulkhead, you are altering that area. And as most of us know, those areas that we alter are prime habitats for invasive species to come in and start taking over, such as Phragmites australis. And if you have invasive species taking over, you are decreasing your native wildlife habitat footprint. But the challenge is how do we support these populations and make them continue to grow, and while protecting our infrastructure? The Mid-Atlantic has the 5th fastest growing rate of coastal populations in the U.S. And that's 40% of the population and 10% of the landmass. And there's billions and trillions of dollars of goods that are moved about in these areas, and they need to be protected. So how do we protect the infrastructure while still keeping it there and having a good place for it to stay and move? But so the problem is that with all this infrastructure in these coastal areas, you have challenges like sea level rise and climate change. And with climate change, there comes more hurricanes. The intensity, frequency, and duration of these hurricanes is happening. But what does this mean for our shorelines? So our shorelines are becoming more inundated and having more impacts. But what is the cost of the different types that are going on? So this graph here is some research from Smith et al. That looked at the cost of maintaining hurricane-damaged shorelines. So hurricanes are causing millions of dollars of damage along our shorelines a year. And how are our different shoreline protection methods responding to that in terms of money and cost and days of how to protect that. So this research project looked at bulkheads, natural areas, and riprap areas to see how much property damage was done, inflicted, and then maintenance. So if you're looking at this graph, properties that had bulkheaded shorelines had nearly twice the amount of property damage costs than shorelines protected by nature-based features. Now, if you switch over to maintenance costs, bulkheaded shorelines also had the most costs associated with maintenance, while riprap areas had the least. But if you switch over to days, riprap areas took the longest amount of time to fix. So if you sandwich all those different graphs together, what you get is a picture of natural areas or natural shorelines do a decent job of maintaining their shoreline in result of hurricane damaged areas. They kind of average out to be the best, where bulkheads cost the most, riprap is the most time invested, natural areas kind of average out to be a little bit better. So with all the different shoreline terms and terminology and armoring, what exactly is a living shoreline? That's a great question. So it definitely depends on who you ask and where you are. You will get a different answer. This is a NOAA definition here, where it encompasses a range of shoreline stabilization techniques along estuarine coasts, bays, sheltered coastlines, and tributaries. It has a footprint that is made up of mostly native materials, so plants that are from the area, and it maintains continuity of the natural land-water interface and reduce erosion while providing habitat value and enhancing coastal resilience. So it can withstand changing times and environmental conditions. Here's a definition from Virginia, where it's a more natural approach to shoreline stabilization. The term living shoreline has used marshes, beaches, and dunes effectively to protect the shoreline along Virginia's creeks, rivers, and bays. And then here's another definition from Florida that says it uses natural materials such as oyster reefs, mangroves, and marsh grasses to stabilize the area and prevent erosion, also protecting property. But there are many different versions of these, as you can see, and you'll get a different one depending on who you ask. But they all have certain things in common. One, they use human intervention to solve shoreline problems and meet goals. They have a native footprint, again, so they're using the plants and materials that are natural to the habitat that's surrounding it. They create overall ecological uplift. So the project itself will end up with more benefits than causing harm and allow for more wildlife to take over or the area to naturally sustain itself. And then they connect aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So they have that land-water interface where if you are a critter and you want to get from upland to the water, you can, or if you want to get from the water to the upland, you can. There's no barrier there that prevents that from happening. And these projects address erosion, wave action, so they're trying to reduce the wave energy hitting a particular spot, coastal resiliency, so they're trying to allow a particular area to adapt to sea level rise. Again, having the natural interface allows you to have more sediment movement going across, where if you have a bulkhead, that blocks sediment from moving in and out of that area. And living shorelines can also allow you to get higher or accrete with rising seas. And then they can also address water quality. So each of these goals will be addressed in various projects in later presentations you will see throughout the course of a couple of days. These tactics alone are not shorelines. You have bulkheads, seawalls, revetments, groins, breakwaters, sills. However, some of those tactics may be used in a living shoreline, such as sills. or breakwaters. Again, the thing to remember is you have that land-water connection where water and animals and wildlife can get through. I mean, sometimes I like to say, think of yourself as a turtle. Can you get from one side to the other? Just something to note. So there are many different types of living shorelines, and Kenny will go into this more in his presentation, but I just wanted to briefly bring this up, that in the very simplistic terms, there's kind of a gray to green typesetting of this, and I'm sure you all have seen this image before. But on the very simple edge, there's vegetation only, where you're planting stuff, to adding more structural components in. And the more structural your components are, the more harder or gray they get. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to living shorelines. You have to design your site and use the pieces and parts you need to adapt to your site and adjust to your goals that you're trying to accomplish. And again, Kenny will go over this in more detail in his presentation and show specific examples. The one question we get asked quite often is restoration versus a living shoreline. Is there a difference? And technically there is. So when you're trying to do a habitat restoration, the main purpose of it is to replace lost natural habitat for its value. Pictured here is Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge, where they did the dune and the beaches, and in the back is the wetlands. So they replace that habitat. It's a restoration. And a restoration usually involves renewing restored or degraded, aka damaged habitat. So trying to get it back to what it once was historically. And then the other key factor with restoration is usually human presence is not really a factor, is minimal, if not absent. But then when you get to a living shoreline, the main purpose of a living shoreline is usually to solve a problem for people. You are, again, trying to prevent erosion. You're trying to protect infrastructure. You're trying to solve some sort of goal. And you do that by manipulating and engineering a design that mimics nature but doesn't necessarily replicate exactly. And then, of course, human presence is usually something you find in these. So like kayak ramps is one example, and this picture here is from Blackbird Creek Reserve, where a living shoreline was installed on either side of a kayak launch ramp to try and help stabilize it. You can also have like fishing access would be another one to try and tie in. So anywhere where you want people to try and get to the site is one aspect. But then again, maybe not. Maybe you're just trying to preserve the area for what it is. So why living shorelines? And we've kind of mentioned these along the way, but again, it maintains that land to water interface. So pictured on the left, you have that living shoreline concept. On the right, you have the retaining wall concept, and you can see the difference in how the critters are interacting with everything. Imagine on the retaining wall being that egret or great blue heron and trying to get food from the water. It's not as easy as if you're standing up there to reach down. But if you're just on the edge, you can easily reach the water. So again, that natural connection going through. And the gentle slope. So the slope also helps with wave energy and getting rid of that and diminishing that along with the plants, whereas this bulkhead, you have the full force of the wave hitting it, which will be addressed in later presentations today. Back to the ecological uplift portion of it. So the animals are connected to critical nursery areas. Terrapins are an example of that animal that needs to get to those nursery areas. You want to have some sort of net increase in the number and types of wildlife as a result of your project. That is the goal. You want to create more habitat for them to live and grow. And you want to allow that sediment to move around. Sediment moves naturally. It should continue to move, and that's how you maintain the supply that you need, although some areas don't necessarily have that supply, which will be addressed later if you don't have it. The plants are also an important part of that. The plants trap the sediments out of the water and allow it to fall out. They slow it down, and then the fact that they trap that sediment allows the marsh surface or elevation to get higher and allows the plants to grow higher. So as sea levels rise, that marsh can slowly accrete and get higher up. Oysters and mussels can also help with that. Pictured in the bottom corner here is a shellbag that was planted at one of our living shorelines, and it has naturally recruited oysters. And they keep getting bigger and bigger in spite of all the sediment and muck they seem to be surrounded by. And then here is talking about allows for adaptations for sea level rise. So the top picture is before sea level rise, and you can see it, the plants are at the edge. They are allowing all interaction to happen between everything, and then as sea levels rise, the plants can move upwards toward landwards. But when you have that bulkhead, there's nowhere for the, if you had a marsh in front of that bulkhead, there's nowhere for that marsh to go because it can't migrate. So any sort of structure that stops the marsh from migrating can potentially reduce the resource of the marsh itself, which can help be protective. They also can reduce wave energy from storms. So pictured here is a photo from VIMS. This was during a hurricane, and that project is a living shoreline project that is completely underwater. And then a few days later, they went out and checked on it, and that is what it looks like. So the marsh vegetation works to knock down and reduce the wave action hitting the shoreline. So like everything, there is a limit. So if the water levels get too high, the ability of that marsh to knock that down diminishes. But they bounce back and are very resilient during storms. They may need maintenance depending on how they're built and tools and that, but they do bounce back pretty decently and help reduce that wave energy. What they don't do is reduce flooding, and that's one thing to keep in mind through all of this is they're not meant to help reduce flooding. So in summary, summarize everything I just said, living shoreline projects are designed to achieve a net ecological uplift and create a do no harm mindset. So whatever actions you're going to do to create that living shoreline project, overall, there will be more of a benefit than harm. And that includes in the buffer, like access to the site. So if trying to put this living shoreline in, you would have to clear a bunch of trees in order to access it. That may not be the best way to access it, or maybe that's just not the best site to do. So it's not just thinking about the actual project footprint, it's thinking about access to it also. And then you want to have the least impact on existing habitat while still effectively achieving project goals. So pretty much what I just said. And each living shoreline fits the unique situation. So every shoreline is different. How you approach the tactic to solve it is going to be different. And it can also be different based on the goal. The way you approach one shoreline for kayak access would be different if you just wanted it to look completely natural. So there are different ways to address stabilizing a shoreline. And again, no one size fits all. The local habitat is key in guiding what types of plants and other materials you might use to build it, and it can withstand and be resilient to changing environmental conditions. The projects address upland bank erosion, marsh edge erosion, protect human infrastructure. They can also protect significant natural resources. You will hear about a project later on that was designed to protect the freshwater impoundment. And they can also be placed in front of natural infrastructure, but also existing hardened shorelines. You can incorporate living shorelines into that design, and we will hear about example projects from that also. So with that, that is the end of my spiel. Are there any questions to begin with before we move on over to Kenny? All right, Kenny, if you want to go ahead and take over, we will go ahead and get started. And if we end early, then we'll just take a longer break. Kenny, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to control here.
Okay. Oh, hold on a second.
Yeah, it's not letting me share my desktop.
Yep. Yeah, hold on. Now try it.
There we go. We got this. All right. Can you see that, Brittany?
Yes.
All right.
Just note that the boxes on your screen are visible, so if they cover up any content, you might need to move them. But you're good right now.
I will just get rid of it. All right. All right.
All right, hold on a second. We have one question.
All right, then I'll wait.
It says, what are common impediments to jurisdictions utilizing living shorelines techniques? Justin, you can unmute yourself. So are you asking about permitting, from a permitting aspect? Or you can type it in the box, either way. Hi, Justin. Let's see. If you like, I can unmute you so you can ask the question. Okay, there we go. Annual lease, yeah. So yeah, so Julia said that annual lease fees are triggered for fill channelward of mean low water line. And yeah, so we'll go into that in day 4 on the permitting aspect. And then Justin asking about the choice to use this option. Is it often engineers or regulators that would prefer to go with the other technique like RIPREC, et cetera? So that depends on the state you're working in. I believe most regulators, and Julie, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, would prefer a living shoreline if it is possible. I know Maryland has rules in place that living shorelines are the preferential option, and you have to justify why you cannot use one. So it really is just depends on the location you're working in. Does that get at what you're looking for? Okay. All right, Kenny.
All right.
Take it away.
Okay, let me close these boxes. All right, so Brittany just gave you a very good overview of what a living shoreline is. We're going to take a couple more shovelfuls of that dirt and dig into it a little deeper. So I'm going to get into some of the project examples that we see in the Mid-Atlantic region. Keep in mind that what Brittany already stated, most living shorelines aren't just one technique. They are a suite of techniques. So you're going to have a project, and you might have 2 or 3 of these project examples or these project techniques. So to keep that in mind as we go through, you'll see some of these projects, and they're definitely not going to just be strictly, fall in this category or they fall in this category. Most of them are going to have a suite of these techniques, so that's just something to keep in mind. And just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Kenny Smith. I work with Brittany in the Division of Waterside Stewardship in the Wetland Monitoring Assessment Program. I'm also part of the Delaware Living Shoreline Committee. I'm the co-chair of the engineering subcommittee. And you'll hear a little bit more about our documents that we have created to kind of push living shorelines forward as the days go on here. So I will just jump right into mine, maybe. All right, so this is a graphic from the Nature Conservancy. I thought this was a good starting point, kind of to break some of these ideas down. So you have like these marsh-based living shorelines. These are very green. You're going to have a lot of, just green stuff. There's not going to be a lot of rock. There's basically, this is going to be using that shoreline, and you're just going to make it as green as possible with using a lot of natural materials. Then you're going to move into a living reef. You're going to try to maybe create an offshore reef, break that wave energy, and that way you can have that back, that marsh. And then you move into something more of like a marsh sill, where you're actually going to use rock to break that energy. And then you're going to have that planted marsh that maybe will connect to an existing marsh, or you're going to, connect this to an upland. And these are kind of where I kind of broke them into. So 1 to 8, I won't read them. We'll go over all these as I go through this presentation. But just some ideas of some non-structural approaches. So you have buffer planting, you have some bank grading, you have planted marshes with fiber logs or fiber matting. Then you have like beach nourishment and planted dunes. So what you're seeing in a lot of this is planting. You're planting this vegetation. That vegetation should hold that sediment on your shoreline. Then you're going to move into some more hybrid approaches. So you have like those low profile rock structures, your sills, your revetments, your breakwaters. But then you can even go into, if you're in areas where you have shellfish, you can try to get that recruitment. So you can use some reef structures, or you can then even go down into the wave attenuation. So WAS, reef balls, reef blocks. These you can be used on maybe your higher energy sites where you really need that energy to be blocked before you can plant or create this, this nice tidal vegetation behind it on your shoreline. So we'll just jump right in. So riparian buffer enhancement. This is like easiest thing to do. This should be fairly simple. This is kind of impacting your shoreline, but in a more indirect way. This area maybe turn a lawn into more of a riparian buffer before you get into your waterway. So this is not only helping your shoreline, but it's also helping maybe with some runoff issues or water quality issues. You can Remove invasive species. That's a very easy way to help the shoreline without actually getting down into your shoreline. Native plant gardens. So all of these, you're basically just improving that upland area before it gets to your shoreline. And will be a running theme. Tree pruning and removal for your shoreline. Shorelines can deal with trees being on them, but if you want a tidal vegetation or any of these more herbaceous plants, you need sun. These plants need sun. So this is something that you'll hear throughout the next 3 days. If you want to have a successful project on your shoreline, you need the sun. So a lot of the time, if you want to plant this nice tidal vegetation, you're going to have that sun. So this is maybe an area where you don't really want to do too much, on the shoreline, but this is an easy way for a landowner to come in and just do simple projects that they can do pretty much on their own, maybe before a project to get it really started. And then you move into like some bank grading. So this is, as you can see by these pictures, this area is pretty steep, and they kind of cut that bank back to get a better slope, and then you plant that. You plant that slope to keep that sediment there. As you can see by these pictures, they didn't really do much landward, so you still have that beach there. So this is more of an upland to maybe your high tide line area. With that, planting zone. So you want to plant anything that you're going to fill or you want to get naturally treated needs to be filled with some kind of plant to keep that sediment in there. This is just a quick graphic. I know Aaron will go into a lot more details on areas of living shorelines and a lot more in-depth explanations of this, but I just wanted to give a brief explanation. You have your low marsh in the mid-Atlantic, that is your spartina alternate flora area. That's your mid-tide to mean high water. Then once you get up higher than that mean high water, you're getting into your high marsh. Your spartina patens is our dominant salty species that you're going to get into. And then you can also get that Iva and that Baccharis bushes, that more woody plant material. And you can see that in the picture a little bit on the right. So then our next one is, so we're starting from like basic, very green, to now we're going to start getting into a little bit more intensive actual shoreline alteration. Bio-based, this could be any of your fiber logs. So that'd be your core fiber, your core matting. All of this stuff is going to provide temporary support. So the idea with these bio-based applications is your bio-based, you're either going to get that natural accretion or you're going to fill behind it. Well, when you fill or you get that natural accretion, you want to definitely plant it. And then once it's planted, the idea is those plants are now holding your shoreline to where before it might have been just a mudflat or very eroded marsh. Now that you have established marsh, that once those fiber logs deteriorate, and we usually think about 5 years they should last. After that 5th year, you're hoping your shoreline is now established. You have that sediment already built up. You have all of that vegetation built up that is now holding that sediment there. So now that your shoreline should be stable. With that, a lot of bio-based, you're also going to incorporate some other kind of technique, whether it's offshore breakwater if you're in a stronger, maybe a stronger tide or a stronger wave action area. You can incorporate shell. If you're near areas with shell recruitment that is possible, why not put some shell out there? I know in the bays right now, some individuals in our program are actively trying to restore SAV. So this might be a great opportunity to maybe try to incorporate some SAV. SAV is a phenomenal wave attenuation, and it's natural, so why not try to put it out there? It also not only helps with wave attenuation, it should help with that water quality. So a lot of that matting will support your logs. It can support vegetation. So that core matting will definitely help that sediment hold the weight of what you're going to be putting on top of it. Here's just a couple pictures of this stuff in action. So you can see the core matting, the core logs, staked down. You can see that it's a lot easier to walk on the matting, especially on that right picture. That sediment is pretty soft. You get that matting down, it actually provides some support. So here's a couple examples. This is a site where they did a core log, backfilled it and planted it. So this is 2013. 3 years down the road, it's a pretty healthy marsh. You can't really see the logs anymore. Unfortunately, the stakes are still there, but you can still, I mean, that's a good explanation of this is 3 years down the road, and the logs now build up over. So all of that sediment is actually, you have sand that they put in, but it's now naturally accreted from the environment. So now you actually have that silty or that fine sediment that is actually laid on top, building this marsh back up. So here's a couple more examples. Once again, you got that sand fill. By the next year, you can see that fine, silky material is now on top. So it just looks more natural. 2016, you can now see that it is pretty much completely vegetated. That log is pretty much over now. So here's another example of maybe bringing the bio-based idea into another project. So maybe this project isn't totally living shoreline, but it's like, hey, why not try to incorporate some living shoreline stuff in other projects? And we'll see that throughout some of these examples. So getting rid of this scattered rubble. A lot of this is concrete. Back in the day, hey, throw the concrete on the shoreline. It's got to be good for it, right? Well, probably not. So they got rid of this concrete. They got rid of a lot of the dying trees that we're seeing this erosion. And once again, you get rid of some of this woody material on your shoreline. It's not always the best option, but if you want to get this grass and these marsh plants to grow, it's going to have to be done. So as you can see, here it is. They created their 3 different zones: low marsh, high marsh, and then an upland transitional zone. And with these core logs built out in front, they built this up, and you can see how healthy it looks. And then and then you can see that they've naturally filled this with sand. After a couple years, it'll start slowly filling in with finer sediments, and now you have that marsh build up. Once that marsh is built up, hopefully when these logs deteriorate, it is nice, healthy marsh, and you don't need the logs at that point. So here's an example from PDE, Partnership for Delaware Estuary. They did this one in New Jersey, put out these core logs, get naturally accreted. They threw some purchase plugs in there, and they also did some salvage marsh grass clumps of the surrounding area where these marsh clumps eroded off. And instead of just them floating around, they actually grabbed them and put them in their project. And then they put some oyster shell bags out to provide a little bit of support on the bottom of the bottom log there. As you can see from the transition here, this is just a hair over a year, and you can see the response that this vegetation has had in this project. The Lewis Canal, it's one of our projects. So the top left is pre-installation of the logs, but same month for the logs in. And then, as you see, next year, this vegetation is slowly creeping out to our logs. Our logs are actually supporting this. And then, as you can see, August 2016, that vegetation is all the way to our logs, and you can barely see our logs now. With this project, we also incorporated those shell bags, as you can see. We definitely incorporated them on the edge of our logs to kind of armor those logs a little bit. Then we also put some at our toe as well. We actually had a natural oyster reef right in front of our project, so we try to incorporate a little bit of oyster shell so we can really get that recruitment, especially since it's already there. So build that up. Why not? And then we move into marsh sills. So marsh sills, we're moving into a little bit maybe of a higher energy site. Either usually low elevation structures, rocks, shell bags, running parallel to your shoreline. The idea is for that sill to knock that energy out before it gets to your vegetated shoreline. Usually you're going to fill behind your sill, Not always, but most of the time you fill behind it, and then you want to definitely plant that. That planting will just accelerate the stabilization behind your sill. And as you can see by some of these other projects that I'll run through, our sills are actually are found a lot in this region. A lot of these areas, so this area needed some kind of definite protection, so the stone sill was put here. So this is actually in front of the Lewis DNREC facility, and it runs right next to the Lewis boat ramp factory. So they put a stone sill in. Those stone sills also have openings, so that's something to keep in mind. I don't know what Brittany was saying. You want that turtle to get from the water all the way to your upland. Well, guess what? That turtle at a low tide, he's got to get back out. So you want to have openings. The stone sill, I believe, had 3 openings, and I believe it was roughly, throw out a number of maybe 100 to 150 meters long. It had, I think, 3 openings. So they planted a tidal marsh right behind that stone sill, and then they actually did some sand sill above that, just to create a little bit more of a better slope to this project. All right. We'll go through these real quick. So this is a project from Virginia. They put some filter cloth place that, once again, that'll help with having that access to that area. Then they filled it. That filter cloth is now holding that fill. It provides a little bit better support. Then they put a stone sill out, as you see here. They backfilled it with some sand, and I think they actually allowed it to get a little bit of natural accretion. There wasn't a whole lot in this project, from my understanding. And then they planted it. And we'll see how it's been doing. So 3 years, you know, you're getting a little bit. You're getting a little bit of rack build up. That 7 years, they now actually have woody plants grown in. They got the Baccharis. They have a different species of plants in there. So they're getting a lot of good natural recruitment from native plants around there. So sassafras, this is a project that it's called Fish and Wildlife Property. Pardo designed this project, and Fish and Wildlife did the installation. You'll be hearing from Chris Pfeiffer from Pardo, and I'm sure he'll go a little bit more detailed in this, so I don't want to take all of his glory. But this project, they have a freshwater impoundment just to the other side of this berm. So there's a berm behind this shoreline. Behind the tractor on the top picture, there's a berm. And behind that berm is a historic freshwater impoundment. They needed some kind of protection for that impoundment because it slowly was eroding, and at high tide, like extreme high tides and storms, they would get blowovers where they would get, you know, this inland bay salty estuarine water would actually go back into that freshwater impoundment, and that's not something they didn't want. So the idea was, well, can we create some kind of living shoreline here to maybe better protect the freshwater impoundment? So when they did this, they decided to do a sill. So they did a sill, and then when they did a sill, as you can see in the bottom picture, they actually lined the openings with this shell bags, and then they have a lower rock sill in between these openings. And what that was, the idea is they have these openings. You can have fish passage, turtles, whatever, horseshoe crabs, whatever needs to move around can move around. So they actually finished construction, and I believe we planted this one about maybe a month later. I was just out there about a month ago. It is very surprising of how this vegetation is doing. As you can see from the picture to the left, this shoreline was dominated by invasive species, so you're getting your frag. As you can see on the right, this is planted. The low area is planted in Alpha-flora, then it was Peyton, then there's a little bit of beach grass planting intermingled at the top edge and right on the edge of the berm. We went out there recently, and this project is now completely Alpha-flora Peytons, very little erosion areas. This Peytons and Alpha-flora is actually starting to creep down, so it's actually filling in some of the sandy areas. Very good example of needed protection. And they have medium energy here. It's not high energy. At these storm events, this wind in wave energy actually pushes really far back. It's a pretty long fetch once you get here. So this project really is doing well. CIB is monitoring this project, so Center of Inland Bays, and they actually have some very good footage of high wave energy hitting this sill, and then the wave energy behind the sill is totally calmed down in a very lower intensity. Then we'll move into what I like to call greening up. So this is an idea of where maybe you already have riprap, bulkhead, or something like that that maybe the landowner just wants to maybe green up a little bit, or you just, you can't get rid of it, so maybe we'll just try to green it up. So with that, this also might be an opportunity where, as you can see, you already have this retaining wall. Maybe the landowner doesn't want to do a slope where they're going to lose some of their elevation. This might be that's an opportunity to where, we won't slope back, so maybe we'll try to build in front of your retaining wall. This is also a good idea when your landowner comes to you maybe with an idea of maybe trying to green something up, but they still don't want to get rid of their what they consider their established protection. And it might be very costly to remove a lot of these maybe building with them would be more cost effective. So these are options where greening might be the best option. So currently, if my understanding, and Julie can definitely speak to this a little bit better, the state does not permit new bulkheads. So maybe if there's an existing bulkhead, or maybe your neighbor has, this bulkhead, but maybe you don't want to build another one, but maybe try to work with the bulkhead. So here's some examples. So this is at the Indian River Marina. This is also one of our projects. So we work with this existing riprap infrastructure that was already there, and we kind of build out in front of it with a lot of green infrastructure. So we put these 4 logs out, we filled it. We also used a little bit of salvage material and plugs. Now, as you can see, it slowly has been building up. That marsh vegetation is moving. This is a perfect example of what shading can do. You can see the shading here is blocking a lot of this vegetation right below the rock here. We do this. Landowners don't want to get rid of the trees and don't want to get rid of the riprap. This is an option. Work with it instead of against it. So this was existing project, Sandfill, like I said. Moving into a little bit of a different idea is tidal freshwater marsh placement. So the far right picture is Blackbird Creek. Brittany kind of touched on that one already. It's not as common as salt marshes. There's a lot more things that you need to think about. A freshwater tidal marsh is actually different than a tidal marsh that is estuarine or salty. Your plant species are going to be very diverse. You usually will have a very persistent seed bank already existing. So this project on Blackbird Creek was on each side of a kayak launch on the Blackbird Creek Reserve. They build up. So the one side had a very good established vegetation. So we kind of just put a core log around that to try to keep that there, keep that sediment there. They were getting a little bit of cross erosion from the actual creek. And then you can see on the other side, we build up a core log, and we try to build up a little bit more vegetation on that side. That side had less vegetation. As you can see in the top left corner, you can see some of these trees leaning over, and they would be shaded. So we actually removed the trees, some of the trees. You can see in the bottom right, we didn't remove them all. We just removed the ones that would impact our vegetation plantings. With that, we put a lot of matting down, we backfilled it, and then we combined with natural vegetation and planting. So when you're, some key terms that I want you to take from using any kind of living shoreline and tidal freshwater marshes is you have to consider a lot of other things. Most tidal fresh marshes are going to be a lot softer sediment than you're seeing in your your normal tidal estuarine salt marshes. And your marsh vegetations are going to be very diverse. So this is something to keep in mind as you're maybe trying to plan for one of these projects. All right, then we're going to move into a little bit more of a harder infrastructure. We're getting into our artificial reefs. So this could be something as simple as shell bags. So Center for Inland Bays and partnership with the Delaware Estuary both have oyster shell recycling programs. So they're actively trying to take that shell that, you go to these restaurants and you're getting these oysters on half shell. They're trying to take those shells and put them back in the environment to try to capture some of the shellfish recruitment that is throughout the Mid-Atlantic here. So you can put them on as a toe of a eroding marsh, as you see on the left side, or you can try to stack them high, kind of like a sill structure, or you can stack them kind of maybe like a breakwater or maybe an artificial reef as a title leads to. You can expect recruitment after about 2 to 3 years if the populations exist in your waterway in fairly close to the project. So the good thing about shell bags is you're getting that 3D growth. So you're not only getting growth on one side, you're getting growth throughout that. And guess what that growth is doing? That growth is just cementing those shell bags in that landscape. You get this recruitment. It is actually creating a uniform, pretty much a uniform, kind of like a sill. It's creating this uniform area, hard infrastructure that this oyster shell is impacting that wave energy, that storm energy before it even gets to your vegetation. So as you can see on the left picture, not only are you getting oysters in here, but you're also getting ribbed mussels and barnacles. All these are good infrastructure for having that protection. And like the bottom picture says, the shell bag or this loose shell is not the most effective, but it is effective still, and you'll see in some of the projects as I go through this. And then if you want to move to a little bit more of a infrastructure, you can get into your oyster castles, your reef balls, or your ready reefs. So this is concrete-based infrastructure that is usually larger, can take a little bit more of that higher energy. So here's a project on the Mississippi Harbor. So as I said before in the beginning of the presentation, a lot of these living shorelines are going to take multiple techniques and throw them into one actual project. So as you can see, you have your 4 logs here, and they actually line their fronts of their 4 logs with shell bags, and then they put oyster castles in, kind of creating these cells, not only to try to capture shellfish, but also to try to capture some of that sediment in the waterway. And then to the right, same project, they actually did oyster castles built up, kind of like a oyster reef, and then they also did piles of shell bags. They actually were looking at this project as more of a research project, as well as trying to protect this shoreline. So they're taking the information they're getting from this project, and they're actually trying to create better ideas of what oyster shells and oyster castles can actually do for your project. So seagrass plantation, I believe Doug is speaking after me. This is his project, so he can speak to this project a lot better than I can, but I just wanted to highlight some of the different techniques that he instituted on one single project. So not only does he have rod reefs, oyster shell toe, so he's using oyster bags on the toe of this marsh to protect it, but he's also creating offshore, not severely offshore, but these oyster shell bag areas where it's impacting that wave action coming into the project. And these are just some simple examples, and this was a much larger project that not only incorporated living shoreline techniques, but also had other techniques for this community. Reed Avenue, another project on the Inland Bays. This was a piece of a larger resiliency effort. So not only did they do a offshore braided reef, as you can see on the bottom left here, but they also did an armored living shoreline, which created kind of a dune area, and they did a lot of stormwater upgrades where actually, you can't see in these pictures, but there's actually culverts coming out right to the left of this dock that were pretty much sediment, just filled with sediment. So they actually were doing their job. A lot of the community on Reeve Avenue and surrounding areas were actually getting flooded just on normal storms or normal everyday tides. So they actually incorporated living shorelines in with these larger resiliency efforts that maybe did not have living shoreline techniques, incorporated in them. But once you actually get to your shoreline, they actually started incorporating these techniques. Reed Avenue is a project that Center for the Inland Bays could speak a little bit more on. So once again, these are all very good contacts to get information from. All right, now we're going to go into a little bit more of a higher energy site. So offshore breakwaters with beach nourishment. So basically these areas, or these projects are found a lot in the Chesapeake Bay. There's a lot more energy in the Chesapeake Bay than like the inland bays. They're not always acceptable, so this is something to keep in mind if you're thinking about doing one of these. I know Doug from Sovereign has done a few of these projects as well. Create stable pocket beaches between your fixed headlands. There's going to be openings. These need proper design. So one of these are actually put at Ashley Island. The Maryland Coastal Bays was a part of that one. So that's another estuary program that is, helping to evolve these living shorelines. They're doing a lot of stuff in Maryland. So with these, you're going to need an experienced equipment operator, and you're going to have to do plantings. Once again, a lot of this stuff keeps going back to you need to do plantings to keep that sediment there. So here's a good overview, nice drone shot of this project. So this one was done by Vin. They put out these offshore breakwaters, and then they planted some of these dune grasses and these marsh plantings. A lot of this sand was fill, but it's also getting natural fill from this everyday water movement. And then we're going to see how some of this stuff is done. So once again, they did the sand nourishment, some dune planting. As you can see, 6 years later, these dunes are doing phenomenal, mainly because they've now had all this vegetation. They're now actually evolving into secondary dunes with some smaller trees. So this is, an idea for maybe a higher energy site where you're actually maybe not getting a lot of visiting, because as we all know, the more human visitation you get, the less vegetation you're probably going to be able to keep. So this is a good example of maybe an area that doesn't get a whole lot of visitation, but you can try to build these dunes up to protect a lot of that infrastructure that is now upwind of these dunes. So these are just some, once again, I ran through these fairly quick. A lot of these projects you'll hear more about as the days go on here, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of a lot of what we're seeing in the Mid-Atlantic for project-wise. So a little bit more at public beaches. So these planted dune grasses help stabilize the sand, and they're tough plants, but they're sensitive to foot traffic. So this is areas where we saw in the previous example where they didn't have a lot of foot traffic, and these dunes just blossomed. With that, keeping that in mind, the less plants you have, the more the sand will move around. So that's something to keep in mind. And then with that, just move into if anybody has questions. I saw a lot of questions popping up, but I didn't have the chat open. So let me open the chat real quick.
That's all right, Kenny. I can go back and read them to you.
Awesome.
Hi. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about individual topics that you need to address. So we're going to start to get down into the weeds and the science, or the mud, maybe that's a better analogy, of living shorelines. So we have Doug, I will let you introduce yourself here in a minute, or in a second, talking about erosion, site geomorphology, tides, and flooding and sediment transport. And again, all of these presentations are available online. I put links to that in the chat for those of you that joined late. So feel free to pull those down so you can take notes on them. And with that, Doug, I will let you go.
Well, thank you, Brittany. thank you for being here. My name is Doug Janik, and I am the Natural Resource Program Manager and Senior Restoration Ecologist for Sovereign Consulting. What I'm going to talk about today is erosion, sediment supply, geomorphology, tides, and flooding. And we're going to look at it kind of in a lens of a living shoreline. There's a lot of different ways you can talk about these topics, but I'm going to try to do it as a person who would go out and maybe evaluate the site and try to figure out what's going on with the site so we know what to do for design and eventual implementation of a project. So lots of definitions and examples. So first of all, definition, what's erosion? And it's very simple. The generic definition is a gradual destruction or a process that destroys or wears away land or substrate by wind, water, or other natural agents. When we tie that into a coastal erosion definition, we tie it more into coastal areas, and we also incorporate some human interference, human structures like with bulkheads, stone structures, debris, you name it. So, but they're very similar. So when we talk about erosion, we have two categories we talk about. One is cause, and this is the source of that destructive energy that results in an erosion feature of some sort. We also talk about symptoms, which is a manifestation of the causes. This is what we see. So when we see erosion or slumping or some kind of unwanted condition on the shoreline, there's a cause creating that condition, and they're two separate and important. We have to make those distinctions. When we look at the causes, we look at wind and waves. They're usually coming from water to land when we look at living shorelines. Not always, but for the most part. And also, if we look at surface water runoff, groundwater or septic seeps, land or shore water movement, that tends to be water movement from land to the water. And that's something that you may not think that doesn't make sense, but when we talk about it, a little later on as we talk through this, then when we get to slope, weight, energy imbalances, that's kind of a mixture of both. Symptoms in themselves, they are not going to solve your problem. They're going to give you a Band-Aid to it. They're going to slow things down, give you temporary resolution of a problem. But if you have a cause, if you don't address the cause, nothing's going to change. That energy is going to come back to your site and it's going to affect it again. Now, so when you do a design, in the perfect world, you want to create a solution that deals with the cause, but sometimes you simply can't. A great macro example of that is when we do beach nourishment in our resort areas of our beaches. The cause is wave energy, whether it be chronic or due to acute storms. But in order to treat that cause, it could be financially unrealistic or infeasible. Also, if you do that, you could also take away from our ecosystem services that we're trying to preserve economically. So all you can do is re-nourish the beach. So basically, you're treating a symptom, which is the erosion of the beach. You're not treating the cause, which is why we come back to do that. So in some cases, you can't get around that. But just to keep in mind, whenever you can treat a cause, you want to treat a cause. Okay, also, when we have a symptom, sometimes it can be multiple causes creating those symptoms. We're going to go through each one of these in this talk. And also, the cause can be very deceiving. And we'll talk, for instance, it can be visual. You'll see something, you think something's causing it, but in reality, it's because of something different. So when you do an evaluation of the beach, there's a lot of items you look at to make sure you can really nail down what's happening there. Again, and you'll learn we'll go through these during the talk. Also, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about wind in this talk, because wind essentially is related either directly or indirectly to every symptom you'll see on the shoreline, because wind also creates waves. So you have wind directly blowing on the shoreline, creating that impact, but also it creates most of the waves, most of the larger consistent waves we have. So it's a factor. So we're just going to acknowledge that. We're going to focus more on, on the other elements here. Okay, talk about symptoms. Talk about slumping. Slumping occurs when you have somewhere in your profile of your shoreline. This is very common with marshes, where you get an undermining, usually below the root mat of the marsh, and it digs out the softer soil, and eventually there's enough weight above that dugout area where it can't support the mass above it, and it just slumps down. These undercuts can be anywhere from a few inches to or actually about 6 feet deep before you've had failure in banks. And here's what it looks like. Basically, once that happens, it just breaks off. This is mostly caused by the mid to low part of the tide range. That's when these waves and energies really digging at this. This can also be caused by when you have a strong nearshore concentrated current, which occurs sometimes. Now, we talk about sliding, which is often confused with slumping. Sliding is a little bit different. It's a fracture on the face of the slope. It's only movement of the earth to move. And also, it comes in many forms. You know, when you hear about like mudslides in California or iceberg chipping off, that's a slide. That's when you have a fracture and it creates a big earth movement. But sometimes these slides can also be irritated by under erosion like slumping, but the main cause is that you have a shear, more of a vertical shear on the surface, and that creates a whole chunk of mass to move forward. This can be caused also by addition. Anything that affects the force affecting the shoreline, the edge of the land. It could be extra water, it could bring more weight. So also, you know, one of your weight times mass creating energy, you have that more in that one pot. Or it can be just pure energy. It can be vibrations, earthquakes, traffic moving up and down a highway next to a steep slope. All these things can cause this. And you know, here's an example where you have a shear forming, and there's no toe erosion here. You notice it's a shear, and it's just making this whole landmass slide in.
Quick question, Doug. Are the causes listed in order of prevalence or effect?
No.
Are they listed?
No.
Okay.
These are just listed. Just as, no, there's no pattern to it. Like I said, every site's different. So, you know, I would say, you know, that you have slumping is much more common in our back bays, in our coastal areas. When you get to cliffs or to very high reliefs, very steep banks, then you can get, you know, you can get more sliding. But mostly what we see around here is it gets slumping from the undercut activity, and also the next two ones we're going to be talking about, especially the toe erosion. That's very common around here, especially with our marshes. So that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Sorry, I mean.
Okay. So toe erosion primarily occurs in the mid to upper portion of your tide. It's when energy is hitting against a shoreline. It finds weak points in the shoreline, and it takes advantage of those weak points, and it keeps digging in. Once it starts digging in, that process gets accelerated over time because other forces are working with that little confined space. And what you get are these cuts, and it looks like toes are forming. You know, that's why they call it toe erosion. One thing about toe erosion, too, is that they tend to form cuts in the direction of the primary direction of the energy that's affecting them. So when you get like a northwest wind, you know, the orientation of these toe cuts are going to be facing toward the northwest. That's a good indicator of where your acute or your heavy energy is coming from. It's not doesn't tell the whole story, but it does tell you a big part of it. And as these toe cuts occur, eventually what happens is that they work around these toes, and the toes slump in. Top erosion is a little trickier. What top erosion is when you get water running from the land to the water, it starts carrying out the water into the shoreline. Now, this is something that happens very much along stream banks as well, in non-toe areas when you have surface sheet flow or you have a little more concentrated runoff. It's actually running from the backside in, and it creates other problems. And also, you can see top erosion tied in with sliding. That's a good time when you see them together. In marshes, what happens a lot of times is the marsh channel can get clogged up temporarily during a storm. Water builds up. You need to find a way to get out. And what happens is that it creates some new channels or changes the drainage a little bit, and there's a lot of back erosion. So you'll see a lot of times when you see a marsh standing out front, and you'll see uneven topography behind it, good chance a part of that situation is caused by top erosion. We look at rills and gullies. They're actually a type of top erosion, but it's a focused version of it, and it's significant enough we can break it apart. A picture on the right that shows a sandbar when the tide's starting to go out, it gets exposed and the water wants to get out, so it finds a weak spot in that bar and it cuts through and it creates a channel. Now, if this is underwater and you're swimming there at a beach, this is what your riptide is. This is exactly what causes the riptide. You have a lower channel area where water is rushing out in a concentrated flow out into the water. It can be perpendicular, it can be angular, but it's a concentrated flow. But this is what causes your riptides, is this type of scour. And then we have surface scour, and this occurs when you mostly in your upper portion of your tide range, and also during storm events where you have waves actually breaking on top of the surface of your landmass. We see a lot of it. It's most obvious in degraded, vegetated marsh areas where the vegetation is standing up, the waves hit the vegetation, and if it happens once in a while during a storm event, they can usually hand up. When you get more of a chronic condition that's happening, especially in the fall, winter, when the vegetation goes dormant, when the dormant stalks get frozen with water, it becomes vulnerable, and the waves just lower the stuff down. And then if it keeps happening, then the biomass can't respond, and it can't stay strong enough to be sustainable. And eventually you have die-off of vegetation, and then you have massive erosion and pocks. And the pocks are based off where the waves are breaking in, where the energy's hitting the top of these things, and erodes vertically downward. So this is very prevalent on a lot of our marshes right now. So it's especially when we have especially on the Jersey side of the Delaware Bay, you see a lot of this happening. Now let's talk about our causes a little bit. We have waves. Waves can cause slumping, sliding, toe erosion, wave scour. Waves are the most common cause of this type of thing, just the constant pounding. And when we talk about waves, and Joe's going to talk about this in detail, but there's two ways that the waves can, when you have tough wave energy, is you get the big waves crashing in and just pounding them. But also when you get a chronic, like you have a 20-mile-per-hour blow, and you have a bunch of small waves, it's a high frequency continuing into shoreline. Like I relate that to like a boxing match where you get some people who have a big knockout punch and they take you out, but then you have someone like Sugar Ray Leonard, super quick. He would hit lots lighter punches, but he would pummel you into submissions. So basically, both these type of wave characteristics can cause significant damage on our shoreline. We talk about slope weight energy imbalances. This is primary sliding and top erosion. They kind of work together. You'll see a lot of these together sometimes. We look at surface water runoff. We're talking about top erosions, sliding, rills and gullies, and groundwater septic seeps, toe erosion and sliding, rills and gullies. One thing about this is that when you talk about groundwater septic seeps, this is the subsurface discharges. They're not coming up, they're coming out of the bank, or even subtidally sometimes. They can be continual, or they can be what's called seasonal supersaturation. Also, you can have unconsolidated loose, but they call it unconsolidated loose soil. That's what really happens, is that the water takes up the pore spaces, and then as that continues to happen, it weakens the soil, how the soil can hold together, and it makes it very vulnerable to other types of erosion, like say from waves and stuff like that. So it's, and it's also, these are hard to detect sometimes, so they can be pretty sneaky. Land and water movement, top erosion, rills, wave scouring. But not all types of erosion are bad. This is a great example, so I want to bring it out, is that longshore drift is part of a natural, healthy process of our shoreline. And basically, you have waves being blown in at typically at an angle on the shoreline, and when it washes back to the ocean, that tends to be a perpendicular direction because it's gravity driven. So what happens is it comes to an angle and it goes perpendicular down back to the water. And every time that happens, you get sediment movement, and that's what pushes sediment down the shoreline. So this is a healthy process. So sometimes erosion is not always a bad thing. It's when it's extreme or when it's in a form that us as humans deem it not being good, it becomes a problem. Here's an example of a problematic situation where when you walk on a beach, a lot of time the beach And natural beaches where there's marshes interacting with beaches, all things, they're not perfectly level. So we have a higher tide come in or a storm event, water could be coming in at a higher elevation. Instead of going straight out, it's caught behind there and it starts running behind the high point. And then it combines with another wash of a different part of the beach. So this direction of flow, when a wave comes in, instead of going right back, it curves around here and combines with more water, and that creates a scour. This can be very confusing in design because you can do a design, all of a sudden it's not working, and you scratch your heads. But the way you can check on this is when you're out there at low tide, you can see these ripples in the beach. These are erosion patterns and water movement patterns. And usually the water's flowing perpendicular to these lines in sand. So when you're walking on the beach and you see these going different directions, you gotta ask yourself, how's that happening? What's causing that? You know, and then you can start figuring it out, and that's going to help you with your design. Because if you don't have any kind of land to shore movement of water when you're doing a living shoreline, you have to compensate for that. If you don't, you're going to get blowouts in the back end of it, and it's going to be a real mess. So we have good types of erosion, and we have some bad types of erosion. Okay, let's talk about sediment supply a little bit. Since the sediment supply is a transport of sediment into a beach environment by fluvial and aerial transport, which is wind. But most of this sediment transport is caused by fluvial movement, up to 95% of it. So, sediment supply is affected by topography. Where's the sediment coming from? It's coming out of mountains, out of plains, out through valleys. All that's building sediment at different rates and bringing it down. Hydrology, you know, what kind of currents do we have near our beach, our shoreline? What kind of tides are we having? Winds, do we have daily or seasonal winds? What direction they're coming from? What's their intensity? Waves, you know, do we have a soft chronic wave, or do we have with acute situations, or a mix? Do we have wake action? That can affect how our sediment supply is. And do we have, in all the periods in our tide cycle, so at what point in our tide cycle do we have the most movement? It can be at low tide, but high tide. It all depends on where it is. Characteristics of sediment are big, and a large versus small, organic versus inorganic. This affects how sediment is carried through the water column and how rapidly it can move and how quickly it can move. And what type of energy it needs to move it. Presence or absence of structural features. Do we have reefs? Do we have outcrops? Do we have vegetation? Do we have sandbars? Do we have groins and jetties? You know, all this affects sediment transport. Do you have inlets that can hydraulically block sediment transport? And also silver rise. Silver rise kind of messes with everything you do with living shoreline. So it's kind of a, you know, this is a catch-all. Everything you do, you got to think about silver rise anymore. So again, talking about this in a little more detail, and I mentioned it quickly, but this is important. You have to, because understanding longshore drift is an important factor, because sometimes you have a lot of that going on. Other times you'll be almost devoid of any kind of long-term drift. So this is a big element as far as whether your site's going to be accreting or not accreting. So naturally that is. So again, the water comes in and goes from a wave perpendicular from the beach and keeps going. So you get a piece of particulates, and it just follows this pattern down the beach. And looking at it from a bigger scale, you have this large channel, and you have these smaller tidal channels coming into a waterway. This channel is going to create delta and sandbars, potentially. Also deposit some sand along the shoreline. We have our waves. In this case, you're saying it's coming out of the southeast, you know, blowing into our shoreline. So you have the source. You got some waves. You got some energy going up to the shore and back down the shore, which is part of our shoreline drift condition. Then we get shoreline drift happening. Then we get to the point where we hit water or we lose our wind energy. And then also we start developing spits or similar landmass, because that's where all the sediment's dropping out. It's not moving anymore. So you have areas where we're going to be growing, and then areas on the right side where we're going to be taking material from. I'd like to point out, though, that when you have offshore deposits, like sandbars, these are caused by erosion, sediment runoff, storm transport, structural features like reefs and the geomorphology, and also they can be a great secondary source of sediment supply for your shoreline. So when you have a lot of borrowing outside the shoreline, if it's natural, that's a good thing. First, protects you from large acute conditions of wave energy, but also a lot of the sand, when you have a bar, the sand doesn't stay there, it moves around, so it can be feeding your shoreline. On the other side of the coin, sometimes bars form because as a result of erosion from the beach. This is particularly common when you have nourishment projects. In fact, when you design a nourishment project, you usually have you have a model or predicted amount of sediment that's going to be removed from the beach right away and create a bar out there. Bars can also be good sources of borrow when you're creating beach nourishment projects. So knowing what's going on with this bars, if you have them present, can be very useful information. So understanding the coastal sediment supply site informs you whether or not you can expect passive accretion on your site, which is real important. Kenny mentioned that one of his project examples where they had to bring in sediment because there wasn't any sediment supply to speak of at that particular site. Also helps you determine whether or not you need to do nourishment. These two kind of go hand in hand. Helps you understand the balance between depositional and erosional forces and influences. So if you know you're loading, you go out to the site, see what's going on there. If you have a high erosion area, you have one or two things. One is that you have high energy or you have poor sediment supply, so it can't replenish itself. So the beach is not resilient. So the beach can be both vulnerable and not resilient. And there are two different things we're looking at living shorelines. Also, it helps you understand, the nature of the vertical and horizontal changes in your shoreline. So if you're having a shoreline that is stable or that it is moving shallowward in some cases, then you have good sediment supply. So all you have to look at in that case might be is what kind of energy you're dealing with, what kind of erosion potential. If you have a situation where you have just the opposite, then you have to look at both of those conditions. So, and also with cuts and some supply. In fact, when we look at your cuts, and we'll talk about geomorphology in a second, which will explain that. So understand the movement, go to the site, look at the observations. You can tie the two together. You start getting a picture of what's happening at your shoreline, and then you can start identifying what to do to help it out. Geomorphology. It's a word that talks about the characteristics, origins, evolution of the topographic and bathymetric features along your shoreline. They can be physical, chemical, biological, or man-made. So again, characteristics. What's out there today? What does it look like? Origin. How did that form? What caused that? And this is an important element. How did you get to where we are now? And also, where's it headed to? So looking back, looking in the past, looking into the future, looking into the present. All this is important when doing living shoreline evaluations and designs. Because this tells you what's going on. This basically leads you to your symptoms and also helps you identify what your causes are. One thing about site geomorphology, there are technical terms, generic terms, there's local terms, all kinds of terms we use when we're describing geomorphology. Look at a shoreline cross-section here. We may say we have a submerged section. We may have a shore section. We may have an upland section. Or the submerged section would be called subtidal, or intertidal, or supertidal. Or nearshore, which grabs a bunch of stuff. All these different terms can mean similar stuff, but you have to know them all so you can talk to different people about it, educate people correctly. Also, when we look at a shoreline, the one thing what people used to do is look at the mean low, look at the top of where the project stops and draw lines. That's your slope. Well, that's not really good enough. It only gives you a gross condition. But if we look at this, but if you look at these three lines, these three planes, one plane is the predominant intertidal plane, the supertidal plane, and then the bank plane. And we look at this example. What we like is big angles here. It tells us we got a general slope all the way through, not just at part of the site. These two angles tell us what our slope regime is within this whole cross section. Up here, these are a little more acute angles. We don't like that. Also, We look at the distance between the two slopes. The smaller that distance is, the better off we are as far as attenuating waves, dealing with energy, and even creating a living shoreline project. When we have very steep, and very high elevation changes, that's problematic. And what do we normally do when we have a situation? We create some kind of feature out there. It could be a stone feature, it could be a concrete attenuation feature, it could be a sandbar, it could be a shell bag, or something that helps break energy and helps hold material in here, whether it's naturally created or nourished. And also, we can do modifications sometimes here if we'd like to do that. And some of this can also go landward more too. But then when we apply our three planes, this is our gross plane. And notice this angle is much less than what this one is up here at the top part. But we look at our three angles, all of a sudden we notice that all of a sudden our angles are larger, which is good. Our distance has gotten smaller, which is good. We've improved the resilience of the shoreline just by changing our angular configuration of the shoreline. This is before we plant, before we pull the green. This is just to give us a good base to create the natural component we want to create. Not to say that this does not create habitat. The shallow tidal zone does create great habitat, intertidal benthics and sediments and whatnot. It's actually horseshoe crabs, spawning areas and whatnot. But when you're greening things up, which is always seems to be a very popular part of living shorelines, this makes it much nicer than what you had before. Let's look at a real life situation. This is a site, this is seagrass, where Kenny showed one of my projects. We have an old advanced sluice here. We have a breach in that sluice creating a scour. And you see it's very different what's going on in different parts of the site. We look at these northeastern acute energy, which is big energy, you'll see that in some cases this fetch hits directly on the beach, unaffected. However, other parts run into the sluice, which is a man-made feature that affects the waves, so it doesn't reach directly to the shoreline. What happens is you have some refraction going over the structure coming out in smaller broken up units. You have some diffraction that wraps around the sluice coming in here, again, in smaller units. So what we have here is we have a divide on our site based off the geomorphology we have on the site, which we have an area that has some minor to moderate effects during this northeastern storm event, but we have another part of the beach that gets much more damage. And you're seeing the sand, the slow dune rollbacks. You're seeing some cutting in here and stuff like that. That's much more impact. So our solution may be different on different parts of this beach because the morphology is different. But also, if you look to your left here, we got these toe cuts in the bottom left that are facing northwest or northwest even, which means we have another energy source coming from that direction. And we do. In the fall and early winter, during the winter, we have this persistent, moderate, but chronic fetch that just grinds and grinds and grinds. So this is another thing. So we have to also look at this energy source as well. Again, it's all driven by geomorphology as far as how it affects the shoreline. Let's talk about tides. A lot of this will be reviewed for a lot of people. Some people might be new. Every tide, every day it tends to be 2 high tides, 2 low tides. During each day, one of the high tides is going to be higher than the other high tide, and one of the low tides is going to be lower than one of the lower low tides. The higher of the 2 high tides is called the higher high tide. And the lower of the 2 low tides is called the lower low tide. Tides are caused by sun, the moon, and the Earth's orbit, or rotation rather. Some terminology. We have the mean tide level, which is the average tide elevation. So it's basically an arithmetic mean. We have the high tide, which is the highest point the tide reaches during a time period of data. The formal definition that that NOAA will use is the National Tidal Datum Epoch. Not all sites will have this long length of time, so you do the best you can. But this is the highest non-storm tide you will get, the highest astronomical tide during a period of time. Mean high water is the average of all high waters during this time period. Mean low water is the lowest, average of the lowest low waters. And then we have the mean higher high tide, which is the average of the higher of the two high tides each day, and its friend, the mean lower low tide, which is the average of the lowest of the two low tides each day during a period of time. How these all work together, if we put this on a vertical scale, there's high tide, mean high tide, mean high tide, mean low tide, mean low tide, in that order. All these are important elements, not just for the design itself, but also for regulatory, because some of these tide lines affect regulatory jurisdiction by both federal and state agencies. They need to be shown on all your plans, at least the high tide, mean tide, and mean low tide. Ideally, you want every plan. Ideally, if you get them all, that's even better. So far, so good. Okay. Now, one thing about talking about tides, similar to geomorphology, there are generic terms and there's formal terms and everything else, different definitions. Ebb tide is the tide that when the water's going out, that's the ebb tide. When the water's coming in, it's called the flood tide. Maybe not kind of a flood, it happens every day, but it's tide coming in. Slack tide is when the tide is changing between one or the other. We tend to have 4 slack tides a day. Spring tide is when you have your higher tides normally during a new or full moon condition, and this is when you have your high tide tides and your lowest low tides, so your tidal range is at its greatest. Neap tide is just the opposite. It's during the quarter of the moons when you have your high tides are the lowest, low tides are its highest, your tidal range is at its smallest. Okay, that's not too bad. Okay, now we're getting into flooding terminology, and we'll talk about some more diagrams to help with this. Stillwater elevation, this is the FEMA term. This is the flood elevation that includes our normal astronomic tide and a storm surge. It does not include wave heights in this elevation. This tide elevation is tied to a plane system, usually now NAVD 88. So you know exactly how high it is. Storm surge is the additional bathtub elevation, for lack of better words, that you'll have during a storm, and it's in addition to your astronomical tide. When we have a storm blowing into land, that wind prevents water from coming out, and it artificially elevates and builds a tide to a higher elevation. That's pretty much what your storm surge is. Your surge is not a wave, it is an additional elevation in the tide. Your storm tide is a combination of the storm surge and your astronomical tide. Why is that different from Stillwater elevation? The difference is the storm tide is not always tied to a plane system. It is just a height. For instance, you look at the Weather Channel. They say we have a hurricane up the coast and we're expecting 20-foot storm tide. 20 foot relative to what? Sometimes it will be tied to a plane system. Sometimes it won't. It's just an elevation, a height. Base flood elevation is when you add your astronomical tide, your storm surge, and your wave for that storm event during a 100-year storm event. That's the elevation. It's the FEMA term, so it's tied to what? A plane system, which is great. Another way of looking at a base flood elevation is the Stillwater elevation plus a wave. Okay. All right, now it's starting to get kind of confusing. I'm saying a lot of terms, a lot of different heights and this and relationships. Let's look at a diagram. It's making it easier to see this. We have the astronomical tide, which is that mustard color. We have storm surge, which is the gray color, which is above the astronomical tide. Those two put together can be considered a Stillwater elevation or a storm tide. When you incorporate a wave, a storm wave, then we have our base flood elevation. Once in a while, you might hear someone say maximum wave crest elevation. That's essentially the same thing as a base flood elevation. The only difference between the two really is that the base flood elevation is really tied to the 1% or i.e. the 100-year storm event. Maximum wave crest elevation can be tied to different events. That's why I see the big difference between these. Also, if you look at the light blue shade area on the diagram, this is your bathtub component. This is the flood. The red component is the energy-filled component. You know, floods can have energy too, but the aggressive energy during a storm is the waves, and that's in the top part here. All right, going good again. Let's talk about some flooding terminology. We have some nuisance and high tide flooding, or sunny day flooding as some people call it. This caused during a couple of situations. You can have full new moons. Also, you may have wind-blown artificially high tides. So the wind's blowing in a certain direction and it stays prevailing in that direction for a duration of time through multiple tide cycles. What it does is it can prevent a tide from draining out properly. So only a portion, only 50% of tide drains out and is holding back 50%, so the wind's blowing against it. Then when the next tide comes in, you have that tide plus another 50% that was there, was held back, that, atypically. But also your high tide gets higher, and then you have flooding associated with it. So it can be a perfectly sunny day without a cloud in the sky, but your road can be underwater. Another important term to understand is called the limit of moderate wave action, or a LIMWA. This is a line you'll see on flood insurance maps. It's usually depicted as a black line with little black triangles tied to it. And what that is that's a point on a land surface during a flood condition where you will be flooded, plus you'll have waves up to 1.5 feet high. The reason why the 1.5 foot high is an important thing is that FEMA has determined that that height wave can cause significant structural damage. All right, let's look at the map a little more. Let's try to make it a little more complicated. Coastally, we have two primary flood zones, an AE zone and a BE zone. The AE zone is a zone that during a 1% storm event, a 100-year storm event, you can experience anywhere from 0 to 3 feet of wave activity and be flooded. Now, within this AE zone, this LIMWA line will bisect it in some manner, shape, or form. Landward side of that line, the wave's going to be between 0 and 1.5 feet. Channelward of that line, the wave's going to be between 1.5 feet and 3.5 feet. So this helps you further interpret your risk and your hazard during a flood condition. The VE zone is channelward of the AE, and it's also during a 1% event, and that's when you have waves, a flood with waves of 3 feet or greater will occur. All right, it's getting a little more confusing, Jen. Let's look at a picture. It always seems to help. Look at the tidal flooding here. This is a flood insurance map. You look on the left side, you have the zone VE. Within the zone, a little white line that kind of goes to the middle through there along the coastline, that's the border. That means you're going to have a flood, and you're going to have a flood that's going to be over 3 feet, and basically it gives you an elevation, EL10. That's your base flood elevation. So it gives you that information too. So not only do you know you have waves, but you also going to know how high the base flood elevation is going to be. If you go inland, you'll see two AEs. The one AE on above it, it's a little bit covered by that green writing, unfortunately, but that's an area that is channelward of the black and triangle line, which is your LIMWA line thing. In that area, you're going to have floods. You're going to have waves between 1.5 and 3 feet within this area, and that you're going to have a baseline elevation of 8 feet. And then the last one down the bottom right of this picture is another AE zone, which is landward of your LIMWA. So you know it's going to be flooding between 1.5 and 0 feet waves, and the baseline flood elevation is going to be 7 feet. And that gray area is supposed it's not going to flood, and we would see it. I have trouble believing that, but that's what it says here based off the modeling. Okay, makes a little more sense now, hopefully.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, I do not have a webcam. My apologies, you cannot see me, but I do have some bags under my eyes because unlike Brittany, I was unable to have my coffee this morning. So maybe I'll speak a little bit more slowly so you can understand. My name is Joe, or Joseph Berries. I'm a CFM and a PE with DNREC Shoreline and Waterway Management section, and I'm also a member of the Living Shoreline Committee that has been involved with the engineering design guidance. And I will be talking to you today about wave energy generally and how to consider wave energy when you're designing and implementing a living shoreline. So fundamentally, waves are energy that move through the water. They are caused by wind, seismic events, swell, wake. Swell isn't a cause, but it's a type of a wave. So ocean waves tend to be swell, which are long period. So in the ocean, you can have wind waves, which are short period waves riding on top of swell that come from a distant storm event or distant wind event. Don't get too bogged down into the equations, but wave energy is proportional to the wave height squared. So waves are characterized by their height and period or length, but length and period are correlated. So the period is the distance between, in time, the distance between, time between consecutive wave crests. Length is the length between consecutive wave crests. And the height is defined as the distance between the height, the crest, and trough of a wave. So speaking to measuring wave energy, if you have a measurement of wave height and period, you can calculate wave energy. A wave gauge or pressure sensors can give you this information. Actually, on one of our projects that we're working on now, Jack Blayo at the University of Delaware has installed a spotter wave buoy, which is a low-cost wave buoy in the ocean, and that's getting directional wave spectrum, so getting height, period, and wave direction. And then my last bullet point there is wave power is also proportional to the wave period. So wave height is the main factor, as its energy and power are proportional to height squared, but it's also proportional to period. So as I mentioned before, wind waves or swell are created by wind blowing over a water surface. Swell comes from a distant water source, so imagine a tropical storm over the South Atlantic. We might get some nice swell up here in Delaware along our ocean beaches, whereas wind, so local wind conditions can cause chop or local winds on top that ride on top of swell. So a general rule of thumb too with waves are with stronger winds, larger fetch lengths, which is the distance of open water over which wind blows, and the deeper the waters, you get larger, more energetic waves. Another erosive force that we have talked about is boat wake. So let's see. So if you're adjacent to a marina or boat, there's a heavy boat traffic adjacent to your site, boat wake is probably something you have to consider. And the power of the boat wake increases with the speed of the vessels, which is why in low wake zones, boats are permitted based on speed, the draft of the vessel, so how deep the hull is, and then the total hull displacement, the volume of water that the hull of the vessel displaces. So going back to hull displacement, large barges can create what I describe as tsunami-like wake, and so tsunamis are special because their amplitude isn't of concern, but their length is very long, so they come to the shore unbroken. So there are other concerns when you're dealing with tsunami-like waves or waves with very large periods. So waves transform from offshore, so swell and wind waves, as they come from deeper water where the orbital velocity that you see in the diagram at the bottom, that kind of circular arrow, does not feel the sea bottom. They are kind of pretty and clean. As soon as they start feeling, those orbital velocities start feeling the bottom, the wave starts to steepen, the wave length decreases, and the height increases. Again, there's a conservation of energy there, so as the wavelength decreases, the height must increase. At some point, that wave becomes unstable because it becomes too steep and it starts to break. And then once it's broken, it will uprush back and forth along your beach. The depth of wave and the depth of water relative to the wave is defined by the wavelength over the depth. So these values give you an indication of where you're at along your beach profile. If you're in deep water where waves are not affecting the bottom, what's called intermediate water where waves are starting to feel the bottom and are starting to shoal and refract and do interesting things, or in the breaker zone. A rule of thumb that most engineers use in the breaker zone or in the surf zone are that waves are proportional to 78% of the water depth. That, in my book, is a conservative assumption. If your beach is very dissipative, the frictional effects reduce that wave height to lower than 78%, but that's a good rule of thumb. If you're working in shallow water, that's your upper limit of your wave height typically. As I mentioned before, waves break because they become too steep. So you can imagine whitecaps on the bay or ocean when the wind's blowing pretty hard, and then depth limited breaking in shallow water. So you're at the beach and you see waves breaking offshore, or in some cases on the beach if it's shore break. How this wave breaks is pretty important. So where the beach is very flat, you have a spilling breaker, so that's where a wave's coming to shore and you just kind of see some sea foam or turbulence at the crest of the wave. There are plunging breakers. That's where waves curl over top of themselves and plunge down. And then the third type is called surging or unbroken. So this is associated with either very steep beaches or very long waves. So tsunami-like waves or wake from large barges might cause this type of forcing where the wave is completely unbroken and it just causes a strong surging velocity up the shore face. Again, so that can either be, so the way these waves break is actually a relationship between the steepness of the wave and the steepness of the beach profile. But generally speaking, flat beaches, you're going to have spilling breakers. A little bit steeper, you get plunging. Very steep or very long waves, you get a surging breaker. So wave energy can be dissipated across a wide beach or a marsh, can be blocked by a structure. You get a little bit of dissipation across a structure, so a rocky sill or an oyster reef not only blocks the waves, but it also blocks or trips up the waves, causing it to break. But it also has a little bit of additional dissipation owing to frictional effects. And then it can be attenuated through a vegetation. So waves through vegetation, the plants, the frictional effects, and the inertial effects of the vegetation attenuate or reduce the wave energy. So again, wave energy attenuates across a wide marsh and dissipates across a wide and shallow foreshore. So these are preferred conditions for a an environment that is protective against waves and vegetation can be successfully planted. So wide and shallow are good things. And wave energy can be blocked at a single location, so a reef or a breakwater. So that speaks to what Doug had hinted at. Maybe the incoming wave condition is too strong for you to establish an ideal profile, so you might have to put in a structure offshore to block that wave energy, so then you can either backfill or naturally your sediment will recruit, giving you that preferred beach profile. So this is a notion from the scientific literature about how marshes erode, and marshes erode proportional to the wave power that they are experiencing above some critical wave power. So that says a marsh is resilient against some level of power, but once the wave power gets over that, what's described as the critical wave power, it starts to erode or retreat. And what is the critical wave power for your site? This is something that I'm proposing. It's not something that's necessarily always done, but I like to look at shoreline inventories. So the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences has prepared a shoreline inventory of the Delaware bays, highlighting where erosion or retreat is happening. So that tells me the site conditions where I expect erosion or retreat. So a lot of times I look at that and say, okay, well, for all the north-facing shorelines, whenever my fetch gets above this length, I'm getting retreat. So if I'm at a site that's north-facing and above that fetch length, we have erosive conditions that we have to deal with. And if you're installing a vegetative shoreline or a living shoreline to repair an unstable or eroding bank, that's an indication that the wave power must be in excess of the critical value. So again, you have to consider everything that's impacting your site, boat wake, swell, wind waves, swell versus wind waves. So what I like to do is I look at, so Doug had mentioned FEMA maps. If you look behind the FEMA maps, there are flood insurance studies, and there are more data provided in those reports. So I like to go to those reports to look at what types of waves I might be experiencing at a site. So if we look at Transect 50 in that table that I presented, I see a large wave period, which tells me that that site is affected by swell. Whereas 51, I'm seeing wave heights and periods that are more reflective of wind waves. So what that tells me as a designer is my client might want me to develop a computer model if I have swell and wind waves, and I might have to drive that not only with a wind field but with a offshore wave condition. Whereas if I'm just in a wind environment, maybe I can go to my client and say, look, I don't need to develop a fancy model. I can just do some fetch calculations, and that'll give me a good handle on what the forcing is. So when you have swell, it gets a little bit more difficult. You might need to be reliant on a computer model or a good time series from a buoy that's nearby your site. But if you're in a site where you don't have buoy data, you might have to be developing a computer model to get at your forcing.
Hey, Joe, real quick, would you mind just explaining what fetch is?
Sure. Fetch is, sorry I don't have a diagram here, it's the distance over open water that wind blows. So if your bays embayment, let's just say, is 100 foot wide and the wind field is uniform over that 100 feet, in that instance you have 100 foot of fetch. So typically along a channel or a bay, you will draw radial lines from your shoreline, and those radial lines to the adjacent shoreline that determines your fetch. And typically so that's what, you look at the plan view of your site, you draw radial lines, that distance is fetch. There's a chance that the fetches might be too long and the winds don't actually blow over that entire length, but that's not usually the case in a sheltered environment. And this can kind of give you that indication where you're experiencing swell, you're not necessarily in a fetch-limited sheltered area, where your wave conditions have that low period and are characteristic of wind-driven waves without swell. Then you can get by doing that radial lines and just applying windrows to a radial field to get an idea of your wave heights and periods. So Doug provided great information on how to read a flood map to get at what your still water elevations are and your wave heights are, but these FIS reports can provide you some additional information with better precision. So you're seeing, decimal degrees, whereas on base flood maps, those are rounded to the nearest whole foot. So you're losing a little bit of precision when you're reading flood maps, which isn't the end of the world. They're a good place to start. And then the other consideration with flood maps is the base flood elevation is the highest elevation during a storm, so it may not be the highest wave height, for example. So maybe the larger waves arrive before peak surge, so you're not seeing the larger wave heights. So that speaks to, again, you have to be well aware of what water levels are important for your site. So maybe if it's a low water level, you're looking at the joint probability of waves and a certain water level. So how often do waves of this power occur when the water level is at this location? So you have to consider these things, the concurrence between certain wave characteristics and certain water levels. So as I hinted at, if there's no swell that in fact impacts your site and it's completely sheltered and just dominated by wind waves, in my book you can get by with just wind wave estimates using simple online calculators or punching some equations into an Excel spreadsheet and having your own little desktop calculator. I said, so I'm showing here that wave protection is required if you have an erosive condition. So by broadening your foreshore, you're going to get some wave protection because it will be, that wave energy will dissipate over that shallow foreshore. If you require offshore wave protection such as breakwaters or oyster castles or WADs, that might be required for you to achieve a broad foreshore. And if you're starting to look at the design of these structures, Kenny hinted at, there's a little bit of design required, so I would definitely consult a licensed engineer because you have to worry about the geotech and you have to size the attenuation devices or rocks or riprap according to the wave power and the substrate that it sits upon. Again, so if wave protection is required, please consult with a licensed engineer because you have to look at breaking wave loads, the travel of a breaker. You have to look at things like the sliding and potential uplifting of a coastal structure, scour. You have to consider tombolo formation, which are crenulate features along the beach, and you have to consider overtopping of sills or structures. And that's all I have, so I'm willing to take questions if there are any.